They were going to hang an innocent woman, and nobody in town seemed to care. The noon sun over Cedar Ridge wasn't just hot, it was angry. It beat down on the dusty main street, turning the air into a shimmering furnace. This wasn't a day for honest work or pleasantries. This was a day for what Sheriff Markham liked to call frontier justice, a prettier name for a lynching. In the center of it all was Abigail Maris. She walked between two deputies, her hands bound so tight the rope had already chewed her wrists raw. Her simple blue dress was torn and filthy, her auburn hair a tangled mess. But her chin was up. Even as the crowd parted before her, their whispers like the hissing of snakes, she kept her chin held high. "Traitor," one man spat. "Got the blood of good men on your hands," screeched old Mrs. Henley, launching a stream of brown tobacco juice that splattered in the dust just shy of Abigail's boots. The whole town had turned out to watch. Shopkeepers, miners, even the preacher's wife, Sarah Mackenzie, who spoke of forgiveness on Sundays but had no trouble finding condemnation on a weekday. They'd all decided Abigail was guilty. They needed someone to blame for the Dalton gang ambush on the Silver Convoy. 3 men were dead, the town's fortune was gone, and this quiet seamstress, this orphan stranger, was the perfect scapegoat. The evidence? A letter. A single piece of paper, supposedly in her handwriting, found at the gang's camp. It detailed the convoy's route, its schedule, its guards. It was a death warrant for 3 men, and they said she'd written it. Abigail wanted to scream, to tell them the letter was a lie, a twisted version of innocent words she'd written to her cousin. She wanted to tell them she wouldn't hurt a fly, let alone orchestrate a massacre. But her throat was a desert, and she knew it wouldn't matter. They weren't interested in the truth. They were hungry for blood. They pushed her toward the gnarled old oak tree in the center of the square. Its branches were thick and scarred, dark lines burned into the bark where other ropes had done their grim work. A crude platform stood beneath it. On top, Judge Harrison waited, his black robes soaking up the hateful sun, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. He raised a hand, and a hush fell over the bloodthirsty crowd. "Citizens of Cedar Ridge," his voice boomed, theatrical and loud, "we gathered today to address a grave betrayal." He let the words hang in the air, stoking the fires of their anger. "The accused, Miss Abigail Maris, stands charged with aiding known outlaws, resulting in the robbery of our silver and the deaths of William Foster, James Creek, and young Timothy Walsh." A woman in the crowd wailed. Timothy's mother. Abigail's heart fractured. She'd sewn the buttons on Timothy's shirt just 2 weeks ago. He was just a boy, barely 19, and they thought she'd sent him to his death. The judge pulled a folded paper from his coat. "This letter in her own hand is irrefutable," he declared, holding it high for all to see. Abigail recognized it instantly. Her own handwriting, her own words, twisted into a confession of a crime she didn't commit. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. "Before I pronounce sentence," the judge bellowed, "does the accused have anything to say?" Abigail opened her mouth, a dry, desperate croak escaping her lips. But before she could speak, a voice cut through the tension. A voice that was quiet but carried the weight of iron. "This proceeding is unlawful." The crowd turned as one. A man was pushing his way through them, his face set like granite. He wasn't large, but he moved with a power that parted the mob like a ship through water. It was Ethan Cole, the blacksmith's apprentice, a quiet man who spoke little and worked hard. Soot stained his leather apron, and his dark hair was damp with sweat. He'd come straight from the forge. He didn't stop until he was at the base of the platform, his gray eyes locking onto the judge. "Mr. Cole," the judge sneered, his face darkening, "you have no standing here. Step down, or you will face charges of interfering with justice." Ethan didn't even glance at him. His eyes found Abigail's, and for the first time that day, she saw something other than hatred. She saw something she couldn't name. He took the steps 2 at a time, his boots thudding on the wood like a death knell for the judge's plans. He stopped in front of her, so close she could smell the coal smoke and hot steel that clung to him. "Actually, Your Honor," Ethan said, his voice ringing with a strange confidence, "I do have standing in this matter." He reached up, his calloused hands gently framing her face. The touch was a shock, a spark of warmth in the freezing terror of the moment. His next words shattered the silence and changed everything. "Because this woman," he declared, his voice rising to fill the square, "is my wife." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Judge Harrison's jaw dropped. Sheriff Markham's hand went to his pistol. Abigail's own mind reeled. It was an outrageous lie, a desperate, insane gamble. Before anyone could react, before she could deny it, Ethan Cole leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a declaration of war. It was hard and firm, a challenge to the entire town. For a few heart-stopping seconds, the world fell away. There was no mob, no noose, no hateful judge. There was only the solid presence of this man who had just risked everything for a lie. When he pulled back, his eyes burned into hers with a silent promise. "You are not alone." The crowd exploded. "Liar!" someone screamed. "Prove it!" another voice bellowed. Judge Harrison, his face now a blotchy, furious purple, slammed his gavel against the railing. "You're lying, Cole. There's no record of any marriage." Ethan didn't flinch. He kept his body positioned protectively in front of Abigail, a shield against the town's fury. "The marriage was performed in Deadwood 3 weeks ago," he said, his voice impossibly calm. "I have the certificate, signed and witnessed. According to territorial law, this woman is under my protection. Any harm done to her is harm done to me." It was a masterful performance. He delivered the lie with such conviction that for a wild moment, Abigail almost believed it herself. Doubt began to ripple through the crowd. Frontier law was a funny thing, hazy on some points but ironclad on others. And a husband's rights were sacred. But Judge Harrison wasn't a man who gave up easily. He leaned forward, his eyes glittering with malice. "I find that hard to believe, Mr. Cole. In fact, I've been taking a keen interest in Miss Maris since she arrived. I've made it my business to monitor all mail coming in and out of this town for security reasons. I can assure this crowd there has been no mention of a courtship, let alone a marriage." A new wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. The judge had been spying on her. The violation was a fresh slap in the face, but it also raised the stakes. The judge hadn't just stumbled upon this. He'd been watching her, waiting. Ethan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "A man doesn't need a postman's permission to court his own wife, Judge. We chose to keep our affairs private." "Convenient," the judge sneered. "Even if such a marriage exists, which I doubt, it doesn't absolve her of murder and treason." "Perhaps not," Ethan shot back, "but it does grant her a proper trial with legal representation. Not this circus." He gestured to the mob, and a few people had the decency to look away, ashamed. The judge saw his control slipping. He needed to reassert his power. "I demand to see this certificate. You have 7 days to produce it, Cole. 7 days. If you fail, she hangs. And if you produce a forgery, you'll hang right beside her." It was a death sentence with a week's delay. How could Ethan possibly produce a legal document that didn't exist? Ethan simply nodded. 7 days. He turned to Abigail and offered his arm, his voice softening just enough for her to hear. "Come, wife. Let's go home." The word wife felt alien on his lips, a fiction they were now forced to live. She took his arm, her legs trembling, and let him lead her off the platform. The crowd parted again, but this time their hatred was mixed with confusion. The immediate danger had passed, but a new, more complicated one had just begun. As they walked toward the edge of town, away from the prying eyes and whispered curses, Abigail finally found her voice. "Why?" she whispered, the single word encompassing 1,000 questions. "Why risk your life? Why tell such a monumental lie?" Ethan didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the dusty road ahead, his profile grim. He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, and his words were heavy with a history she couldn't begin to understand. "Because 3 years ago, I stood by and did nothing while innocent people died. I made a choice I've regretted every day since." He finally turned to look at her, his gray eyes dark with a pain that seemed bottomless. "Today, I made a different choice." They were walking toward Mrs. Patterson's old house, a derelict shack on the edge of the desert that had been empty for a year. It was their new home, their hideout, their prison. As they approached the sagging porch, Abigail realized the judge's threat wasn't the only thing they had to worry about. Two men stepped out from the shadows of the porch. They were rough-looking, the kind of men who lived by the gun and died by it. They weren't from Cedar Ridge, and they were blocking the door. One of them, a man with a jagged scar across his cheek, grinned, showing a row of yellowed teeth. "Judge Harrison sends his regards," he said, his voice a low growl. "He said you might need some chaperones to make sure you don't decide to leave town before your 7 days are up." They weren't just being watched from afar. The judge had put guards on them. They were prisoners in their own make-believe home. Ethan's body went rigid beside her, his hands subtly moving closer to the heavy blacksmith's hammer that still hung from a loop on his belt. He had saved her from the noose, only to walk them both into a cage, and the wolves were circling. The two men were a constant, menacing presence. They took turns, one always sitting on a crate by the porch steps, whittling a piece of wood with a knife that looked sharp enough to shave a whisper. He'd watch their every move, his eyes cold and flat. The other would patrol the perimeter of the small, dusty property. They were a living wall, a constant reminder that Judge Harrison held their leash. Inside the dilapidated house, the silence was as thick as the dust. Ethan worked with a furious, focused energy, patching the leaking roof, reinforcing the door, his hammer blows echoing the frantic beating of Abigail's heart. He was a blacksmith, a builder, but she was beginning to suspect he was also something else entirely, something more dangerous. "The marriage certificate," she said on the second day, her voice sounding loud in the quiet room. "You said you have it." Ethan didn't stop his work. He was planing a warped floorboard, his muscles coiling and releasing with each steady push. "I have a friend in Deadwood," he said, his voice tight. "A clerk. He owes me a favor." "A favor big enough to risk his own neck for forgery?" she pressed. Forgery was a hanging offense. He wasn't just risking his own life. He was asking someone else to risk theirs too. He finally stopped and looked at her. The calm, steady blacksmith was gone. In his place was a man with old, haunted eyes. "He's not a clerk," Ethan admitted. "And he owes me more than a favor. He owes me his life. The certificate will be here. It will be real enough to fool Marshall Duncan." Marshall Duncan. The name sent a fresh shiver of fear through her. The territorial marshal was known to be a man of bulldog tenacity and unbending law. He wasn't some small-town sheriff who could be swayed by mob rule. If he found even the slightest hint of fraud, they were both finished. "Who are you, Ethan?" she asked, the question she'd been holding back since he'd stepped onto that platform. He went back to his work, his shoulders a wall of muscle and secrets. "I'm the man who's going to keep you alive," he said, and the finality in his tone told her the conversation was over. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, they had a visitor. Not one of the judge's thugs, but Sheriff Markham himself. He rode up alone, his face etched with worry. He dismounted but kept his distance from the guard on the porch. "Cole," he said, his voice low, "I need a word." Ethan met him by the fence line, out of earshot of the guard. Abigail watched from the grimy window, trying to read their body language. The sheriff looked agitated, speaking in quick, hushed tones, gesturing back toward the town. Ethan stood like a statue, listening, his face giving nothing away. After a few minutes, the sheriff nodded grimly, mounted his horse, and rode away without a backward glance. Ethan came back inside, his face pale beneath the grime. "What is it?" Abigail asked. "What did he want?" "The judge isn't just waiting for the 7 days to run out," Ethan said, his voice a low growl. "He's building a new case. He sent his deputies to collect depositions. He's twisting every innocent thing you've ever done in this town into a new piece of evidence. He's making sure that even if the marriage certificate is real, he'll still have a dozen other reasons to hang you." He was making sure she had no escape. Every path was being blocked, every hope systematically extinguished. "Why?" she whispered. "Why does he hate me so much?" "It's not about you," Ethan said, his gray eyes burning with a sudden, fierce intensity. "Not really. I saw something in his eyes on that platform. Greed. Pure, rotten greed. The silver convoy. It was carrying more than just the mining profits. It was carrying the territorial payroll. Enough money to make a man a king, and it's all gone. But they said the Dalton gang took it. The Daltons hit the convoy, sure, Ethan said. But Markham said the strongbox they found at the gang's camp was empty. Not just empty. It was pried open with a specialized tool. A tool only one company makes. A tool used by banks and assay offices to open boxes when the keys are lost. Abigail's mind raced. So the Daltons were ambushed by someone else after they robbed the convoy? Someone who took the payroll? Or, Ethan said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, someone on the inside gave the Daltons the convoy's route, let them do the dirty work, and then took the real prize for themselves, leaving the gang to take the fall. An inside job. Someone from Cedar Ridge. Someone who wanted all that money and needed a scapegoat to cover their tracks. Someone like Judge Harrison, Abigail breathed. Suddenly, it all made a horrifying kind of sense. His obsession with her, his spying, his determination to see her hang quickly, without a real trial. He wasn't seeking justice. He was tying up a loose end. But why her? She had nothing to do with any of it. Unless she knew something she didn't realize she knew. Before she could process the terrifying thought, the guard on the porch suddenly straightened up. Another rider was approaching, coming fast from the east. It was Johnny Summers, the telegraph operator's son. He skidded to a halt, his eyes wide with urgency. "Mr. Cole, a telegram for you. Came through the wire from Deadwood." Ethan strode out onto the porch, his hand outstretched. The guard watched him, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Ethan tore open the envelope. Abigail watched his face as he read, looking for any flicker of hope or despair. His expression didn't change. It remained a mask of stone. But she saw his hand, the one holding the telegram, clench into a fist so tight his knuckles went white. He crumpled the paper into a ball. "Bad news?" the guard sneered. Ethan's eyes lifted from the crumpled paper and met the guard's. And for the first time, Abigail saw a flicker of something truly terrifying in his gaze. It was the cold, flat certainty of a man who had just run out of good options. "Change of plans," Ethan said, his voice dangerously soft. Then in a blur of motion, too fast to follow, he swung the hammer he was still holding in his other hand. It connected with the guard's jaw with a sickening crack. The man crumpled to the ground without a sound. The second guard, hearing the commotion, rounded the corner of the house, his gun already drawn. He never got a chance to fire. Ethan threw the hammer with inhuman speed and accuracy. It spun end over end, catching the man squarely in the chest, knocking him off his feet with a strangled gasp. Ethan was on him in a second, disarming him, his movements precise and brutal. It was over in less than 10 seconds. 2 armed men, taken down by a blacksmith with a hammer. Abigail stared, her heart pounding in her throat. This was no blacksmith. This was a trained fighter, a killer. Ethan stood over the 2 unconscious men, breathing heavily. He looked up at her, his face a grim landscape of regret and resolve. "My friend in Deadwood," he said, his voice raspy. "He's dead, murdered in his office an hour after he sent the telegram." He kicked the crumpled paper at his feet. "The certificate isn't coming. Someone made sure of it." Their last hope was gone. The judge had won. They had no proof, no allies, and now they were fugitives. "What was in the telegram?" Abigail whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan finally looked at her, and the raw truth of their situation was laid bare in his eyes. It wasn't a message, it was a warning, the last word he ever wrote. He took a deep, shuddering breath. Run. There was no time to think, no time to pack. They were on horseback in minutes, Ethan having saddled the 2 best animals from Mrs. Patterson's neglected stables. He'd taken the guns and ammunition from the 2 guards, strapping one pistol to his own hip and pressing the other into Abigail's hands. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked, his voice tight with urgency. I've shot at bottles before," she stammered. The cold, heavy weight of the weapon was terrifyingly real. "Point it at the center of a man and pull the trigger until it's empty," he said grimly. "Don't hesitate. Hesitation gets you killed. They rode hard away from the town, heading not for the main road but for the rugged, unforgiving wilderness of the surrounding mountains. Ethan seemed to know the terrain, navigating the rocky trails and shadowy canyons with an instinct that spoke of long familiarity. The blacksmith story was more than just a cover. It was a complete fabrication. Every stride of the horse put more distance between them and Cedar Ridge. But Abigail knew they weren't running towards safety. They were running deeper into the wolf's den. The high desert was a brutal, beautiful place. Spires of red rock clawed at a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The air was thin and sharp, scented with pine and dust. But there was no beauty in it for Abigail. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of a posse. They rode until the horses were lathered and darkness began to fall, finally taking shelter in a shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of ancient junipers. Ethan built a small, smokeless fire, its flames barely visible from more than a few feet away. He finally spoke as he cleaned the guns, his movements economical and practiced. "Judge Harrison didn't just kill my friend," he said, his voice low and laced with cold fury. "He killed Deputy Marshal James Peterson." The truth came out in a torrent. Ethan wasn't a blacksmith. His name wasn't even Ethan Cole. It was Nathan Cross. He was a U.S. Marshal, or at least he had been. "I was working undercover," he explained, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames. The territorial government suspected a leak. Gold and payroll shipments were getting hit too often, too precisely. The intel was good. Too good. It had to be coming from the inside. "I came to Cedar Ridge posing as a blacksmith to watch, to listen. I suspected Judge Harrison from the start. He lives too well for a man on a public servant's salary. He'd been building a case, slowly, carefully, but the convoy robbery had forced Harrison's hand. He needed a scapegoat, fast, and Abigail, the quiet outsider, was the perfect choice." "The letter," Abigail said, her mind reeling. "He knew it was a forgery." "He orchestrated it," Nathan corrected her. "He had it stolen, altered, and planted. When I stepped in and claimed you were my wife, I wrecked his plan for a quick, quiet hanging. I forced him into a legal corner, so he did what desperate men do. He started killing anyone who could expose him. Starting with James Peterson, the man who was supposed to be forging their salvation. The weight of it was crushing. Men were dead. They were fugitives. And a powerful, ruthless man was now hunting them with the full corrupted power of the law at his back. "What do we do now?" she whispered, the enormity of their situation threatening to swallow her whole. Nathan finished reassembling his pistol with a final decisive click. He looked at her, and the firelight cast his face in sharp angles of shadow and light. The haunted look was gone, replaced by something harder, colder. "We stop running," he said. "We've been playing his game, by his rules. Now we play by mine." "What is your game?" "He thinks he's the hunter," Nathan said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time. "It's time to remind him what it feels like to be the prey. He has the law, the money, and the town on his side. But we have something he doesn't." "What's that?" "Nothing left to lose." His plan was insane. It was reckless. It was almost certainly a suicide mission. He didn't want to run to the next territory and report Harrison. That would take weeks, months. By then, the trail would be cold, the evidence gone. Harrison would have time to bury his secrets so deep no one would ever find them. No. Nathan wanted to go back, not to Cedar Ridge, but to the place where it all began, the site of the convoy ambush. "Harrison is arrogant," Nathan explained as they rode the next morning, their path circling back toward the low, rugged hills west of town. "He thinks he's won. He thinks we're running for our lives. The last thing he'll expect is for us to go back to the scene of the crime." "What are we looking for?" Abigail asked, scanning the horizon nervously. "The truth," he said simply. "The official report says the Dalton gang hit the convoy and were driven off by the guards. But 3 guards died. The Daltons were notoriously efficient. If they had the element of surprise, they wouldn't have left any witnesses. Something about the story doesn't add up." The ambush site was a grim tableau of violence. The skeletons of 2 horses lay half buried in the dust. The ground was littered with spent shell casings. A broken wagon wheel leaned against a rock, a silent testament to the chaos of the attack. Abigail's stomach churned. Good men had died here, men she knew, and she had been blamed for it. A cold anger began to burn through her fear. Nathan was right. Running wouldn't bring justice for these men. They searched the area for hours under the relentless sun. Nathan moved with the practiced eye of a seasoned investigator, examining the ground, the position of the casings, the angles of fire. This wasn't a simple ambush, he muttered, kneeling by a cluster of rocks. This was a three-way fight. He pointed to the different types of shell casings littering the ground. These are from the Guards' rifles, standard Army issue. These are from the Dalton's pistols. But these, he picked up a third, different casing. These are from a Sharp's rifle. Long range, fired from up there. He gestured to a high ridge overlooking the canyon. Someone else had been here. A third party, a sniper. As Nathan scanned the ridge, Abigail's eyes were drawn to something else. A flash of color half hidden under a scrubby bush. It was a scrap of fabric, blue calico, the same simple, common fabric as her own dress. She picked it up. It had been torn from a sleeve, and the stitching was distinctive. It was a cross-hatch pattern, a little flourish she added to all her mending work to make it stronger. She knew this stitch. She had done this stitch 100 times, but she hadn't done it on her own clothes. Her blood ran cold as the memory hit her. A few days before the ambush, a customer had come to her shop, a woman. She'd brought in a dress to be mended, a simple blue calico with a torn sleeve. Abigail hadn't thought anything of it at the time, but now she remembered the woman's face. She remembered the hushed, nervous way she spoke, and she remembered the name. It was Sarah Mackenzie, the preacher's wife, the woman who had pursed her lips and spat at Abigail's feet as she was led to the gallows. Why would a scrap of the preacher's wife's dress be here, at the site of a bloody massacre? It made no sense. Unless she wasn't just the preacher's wife. Suddenly another piece clicked into place. A stray bit of town gossip Abigail had overheard weeks ago. Sarah Mackenzie hadn't always been a preacher's wife. She'd come to Cedar Ridge a few years back from Kansas. She'd been a widow, they said. Her first husband, a farmer, had been killed by outlaws. Outlaws from Kansas, like the Dalton gang. What if her husband hadn't been killed by the Daltons? What if he'd been one of them? Nathan, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I think I know who the inside man is, and it's not a man. Before he could respond, the crack of a rifle echoed through the canyon. The bullet kicked up dust a foot from Nathan's head. They were being shot at. The sniper from the ridge was back, or they had never left. They scrambled for cover behind the rocks as more shots rained down on them. The sniper was good, pinning them down, his bullets chipping away at their flimsy shelter. They were trapped. Who is it? Nathan yelled over the gunfire. I don't know, Abigail cried back, pressing herself against the stone. But they knew we'd come here. It had to be one of Harrison's men. He must have realized his mistake in letting them escape and sent someone to clean up the mess, to silence them for good. But the sniper wasn't just trying to kill them. He was hurting them. His shots were deliberately forcing them back, deeper into the narrow winding canyon, away from their horses, away from any chance of escape. He's pushing us towards something, Nathan realized, peering cautiously over the rock. It's another trap. They had no choice but to keep moving, darting from one piece of cover to the next, the sniper's bullets always a step behind them. The canyon grew narrower, the walls steeper, until they were funneled into a dead end, a box canyon with sheer rock walls on three sides. The gunfire stopped. A new sound echoed through the sudden silence. The clink of spurs on stone. A figure appeared at the mouth of the canyon, blocking their only exit. The sun was behind him, turning him into a dark, menacing silhouette. It wasn't one of the judge's hired thugs. It was Sheriff Markham, and he wasn't alone. Behind him stood Deputy Coleman and two other men Abigail recognized as council members, banker Theodore Whitman and mine foreman Lucas Brennan. They all held rifles, and all of them were pointed directly at Nathan and Abigail. It's over, Cross, Markham said, his voice heavy with a grim finality. His use of Nathan's real name confirmed their worst fears. He wasn't here to rescue them. He was part of it. "You were the leak, Markham," Nathan said, his voice flat and cold. He didn't seem surprised. He seemed disappointed. "All this time it was you." The sheriff flinched, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "I didn't have a choice," he said, his voice cracking. "The judge, he has my boy. He knows what Ben did back in Cheyenne. He was holding it over my head. A father protects his son, Cross, at any cost. Blackmail. It was always uglier and sadder than simple greed." "So you helped him frame an innocent woman?" Abigail's voice dripped with contempt. "You let him send these men to their deaths?" "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," Markham insisted, his eyes pleading. "The plan was simple. I'd feed the convoy route to a local stick-up artist, a man named Silas Dorn. He and his crew would hit the convoy, take the payroll, and disappear. Harrison gets the money, I get the evidence of my son's crime burned, and no one gets hurt. But Dorn got greedy. He brought in the Dalton gang without telling us. They're killers, not just thieves. They weren't supposed to leave witnesses." Silas Dorn, the name from the judge's posse's taunts. He was the key. "And the sniper?" Nathan asked. "The one who was here during the ambush?" A cruel smile spread across Banker Whitman's thin face. "Contingencies, Marshal. One must always have contingencies. When the Daltons started shooting, our associate on the ridge was forced to even the odds. And now he will do so again." As if on cue, a figure appeared on the canyon rim above them. The sniper. And as the sun caught their face, Abigail's blood turned to ice. It wasn't a man. It was Sarah Mackenzie, the preacher's wife. In her hands she held a Sharps rifle, and her face was a cold, emotionless mask. The pious churchgoer was a killer. The grieving widow was the deadliest part of Harrison's entire conspiracy. "You see, Marshal," the banker continued, savoring the moment, "this town has a way of taking care of its own. You and the girl have become a liability, an unfortunate loose end." They were completely, utterly trapped. 4 guns in front of them, 1 above them. There was no cover, no escape. This was where they were going to die. Abigail looked at Nathan, her heart filled with a terrible, aching regret. He had tried to save her, and she had only dragged him down with her. He caught her eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He wasn't giving up. He subtly shifted his weight, his hand hovering over the pistol at his hip. He was going to try something. He was going to die fighting. Suddenly, a new voice echoed through the canyon, a loud, booming voice they all recognized. "That's far enough, gentlemen." Judge Harrison. He appeared at the mouth of the canyon, standing beside Markham's men. But he wasn't looking at Nathan and Abigail. He was looking at the banker and the mine foreman, and he was flanked by 2 more men, the territorial Marshal Duncan and his deputy. "Banker Whitman, Foreman Brennan," the judge declared, his voice ringing with authority. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, robbery, and the murder of 3 good men." The banker's jaw dropped. Markham looked utterly bewildered. "What in the hell is going on?" he stammered. Marshal Duncan stepped forward, his eyes as cold as a winter sky. "It's called a confession, Sheriff. One we got from a man named Silas Dorn an hour ago. Seems he wasn't too happy about being double-crossed by his partners. It was another trap, but it wasn't for them. It was for the conspirators." "You!" Whitman shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the judge. "You set us up. This was your plan." "My plan was to expose the corruption that has been poisoning this territory," the judge said, his voice dripping with false piety. "I have been working with Marshal Cross from the very beginning. We used Miss Maris as bait, knowing the real culprits wouldn't be able to resist silencing her." Abigail felt the world tilt on its axis. Bait? She had been used? By Nathan? She looked at him, her eyes wide with betrayal. He wouldn't meet her gaze. Up on the ridge, Sarah Mackenzie seemed to realize the game was up. She raised her rifle, but not toward Nathan or Abigail. She aimed it squarely at Judge Harrison. "You promised me a new life," she screamed, her voice raw with fury. "You promised me I'd be safe." "You chose your side, Sarah," the judge said calmly. Before she could fire, another shot rang out. Not from the canyon floor, but from another position on the ridge. Sarah Mackenzie stiffened, a look of surprise on her face. Then she crumpled and fell from sight. Sheriff Markham stood with his pistol smoking, his face a mask of agony. "My son is safe now, Judge," he said, his voice hollow. "My debt is paid." He had made his choice. He had sided with the law, buying his son's freedom with the blood of his co-conspirator. It was over. The plot had unraveled in a cascade of betrayal and bloodshed. The banker and the foreman dropped their guns, their faces ashen. Marshal Duncan walked toward Nathan and Abigail, his expression unreadable. "You played a dangerous game, Cross," he said. Nathan finally looked at Abigail, and the guilt in his eyes was a physical blow. "I'm sorry, Abigail," he whispered. "There was no other way. I had to let them think you were alone and vulnerable. I had to let them think I had abandoned my mission. It was the only way to make them show their hand." His words made a cold, logical sense, but they did nothing to warm the ice that was forming around her heart. She had been a pawn. Her terror, her near-death experience, it had all been part of his grand strategy. He had stood by and watched them drag her to the gallows, all as part of his plan. He hadn't saved her out of compassion. He'd saved her because she was his bait. The man who had kissed her, the man who had called her his wife, the man who had made her feel safe for the first time in years. He was a stranger, a liar, and he had broken something inside her that she wasn't sure could ever be fixed. The ride back to Cedar Ridge was a somber procession. Banker Whitman and Foreman Brennan were in chains, their arrogance replaced by a sullen, terrified silence. Sheriff Markham rode with his head bowed, a man broken by the choices he'd made to protect his family. The body of Sarah Mackenzie was slung over a horse, a grim reminder of the violence that had torn their community apart. Abigail rode beside Nathan, the silence between them a vast, empty canyon. He tried to speak to her several times, his voice low and earnest, but she couldn't bring herself to listen. Every word felt like another lie, another piece of the elaborate deception he had built around her. She had been a chess piece in his game, and the fact that he'd won brought her no comfort. Back in town, the news spread like a plague. The pillars of their community, the judge, the banker, the sheriff, all embroiled in a conspiracy of murder and theft. The town was in shock, the citizens gathering in stunned, whispering groups. The righteous anger they had once directed at Abigail now had nowhere to go, leaving behind a bitter residue of shame. Marshal Duncan held a public inquiry in the very square where they had tried to hang her. He laid out the whole sordid story for the town to hear. He explained how Judge Harrison, a man they had trusted, had masterminded the entire plot. His story was that he, the judge, had been a hero, working with the marshals to uncover the plot. But as he spoke, Abigail watched Nathan's face, and she saw the flicker of disgust in his eyes. Later that evening, Nathan found her by the creek at the edge of town. She was throwing stones into the water, each splash a small, unsatisfying release of the turmoil inside her. "He's going to get away with it, isn't he?" she said without looking at him. "Judge Harrison. He'll twist the story, paint himself as a hero, and walk away clean." "For now," Nathan said quietly. "But men like Harrison always get sloppy. They always make another mistake. I'll be waiting when he does." "Will you?" she asked, her voice sharp with bitterness. "Or will you find another innocent woman to use as bait?" The words hit him like a punch. He flinched, his face tight with pain. "Abigail, what I did, it was the only way. I couldn't tell you the truth. If you had known you were part of a sting, they would have sensed it. You had to truly be afraid. Your fear had to be real." "Oh, it was real," she said, her voice trembling. "Congratulations, Marshal. Your plan worked perfectly. I hope you're proud of your performance." "No," he said, stepping closer. "I'm not. I hate what I had to do. I hate that I had to lie to you. From the moment I stepped on that platform, the lies started to feel different. It wasn't just a cover story anymore." He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "When I kissed you," he said, his voice dropping to a raw whisper, "that wasn't part of the plan. That was for me. I saw them about to destroy you, and something inside me just broke. I told you I made a choice that day. The choice was to save you. Everything else came after. She wanted to believe him. A part of her, a desperate, lonely part, screamed at her to accept his words, to fall into the arms of the man who had, in the end, saved her life. But the betrayal was too fresh, the wound too deep. "What about the certificate?" she asked, her voice cold. "Was James Peterson a real marshal?" "Yes," Nathan said. "He was my partner, a good man. Harrison's people got to him before he could finish the forgery. He sent the warning just before they broke down his door." "And our marriage?" she asked, the final heartbreaking question. "Was any of it real to you?" "It is now," he said, his eyes pleading with her. "Abigail, I know I don't deserve your trust. I know I broke it. But I'm asking you to let me earn it back. Let me show you that the man who stood by you wasn't a lie." Before she could answer, a boy came running toward them from the town. It was young Johnny Summers, the telegraph operator's son. "Marshal Cross!" he panted, skidding to a halt. "Another telegram. It's marked urgent from the territorial capital." Nathan took the message, his brow furrowed with concern. He read it, and a strange expression crossed his face, an expression of profound, weary shock. "What is it?" Abigail asked, her curiosity overriding her anger. He handed her the paper. Her eyes scanned the clipped official language. It was a report from the territorial governor. Judge Harrison had been under investigation for months for widespread corruption. But the most shocking part was the final line. "Suspect Silas Dorn, apprehended this morning, has provided full confession. Implicates Judge Harrison as mastermind of convoy robbery and murder of Deputy Marshal James Peterson." Silas Dorn, the man Markham said had brought in the Dalton gang. The man Marshal Duncan had claimed gave a confession. But that confession had implicated the banker and the foreman, not the judge. "I don't understand," Abigail said, looking up at Nathan. "Duncan said Dorn's confession exposed Whitman and Brennan." "Duncan lied," Nathan said, a slow, cold realization dawning on his face. He was in on it too. He was Harrison's ace in the hole. He used Dorn's real confession to arrest the lesser partners, letting Harrison walk away. He was protecting him. The conspiracy wasn't over. It was deeper and more rotten than he had ever imagined. The corruption went all the way up to the man sent to enforce the law. Marshal Duncan was dirty, and Judge Harrison, thinking he was now completely in the clear, was still in town. "He's at the saloon," Nathan said, his voice a low growl. "Duncan is with him. They're celebrating." He started walking toward the town, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. His movements were filled with a deadly purpose. "What are you going to do?" Abigail asked, running to keep up with him. "Finish the job," he said, his eyes like chips of flint. "Harrison played his game. Duncan played his. Now I'm going to play mine." He wasn't going to arrest them. He wasn't going to wait for the slow, corrupt gears of justice to turn. He was going to end it, right here, right now. She could let him go. She could walk away, finally free, and let him handle the bloody fallout. It was his fight, not hers. But as he walked toward the lights of the saloon, toward a confrontation that would almost certainly get him killed, she realized she couldn't. The lie he had told, the game he had played, it had saved her life. He had stood between her and a noose, whether it was for duty or for something more. He had been there when no one else was. She looked down at the pistol he had given her, still tucked into the waistband of her dress. He had made his choice on that platform. Now it was her turn to make hers. The Silver Dollar Saloon was crowded, the air thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and cigar smoke. Laughter and rowdy conversation bounced off the wood-paneled walls. In a back corner, at a table littered with whiskey bottles and playing cards, sat the architects of Abigail's misery: Judge Harrison, Marshal Duncan, and the newly appointed Sheriff Markham, who looked like a man attending his own funeral. Harrison was holding court, his voice booming over the din, accepting congratulations from sycophants who now praised him as the town's savior. Duncan sat beside him, a smug, satisfied smile on his face. They looked untouchable, triumphant. The saloon doors swung open, and a hush fell over the room. Nathan Cross stood in the doorway, the setting sun at his back. He wasn't wearing a marshal's badge. He looked like what he was, a tired, angry man who had been pushed too far. Harrison, he said, his voice quiet but cutting through the noise like a razor. Your party's over. The judge's smile vanished. Duncan's hand slowly moved toward his coat, where his pistol was holstered. Cross, Duncan said, his voice a low warning. You're making a big mistake. Walk away. I'm tired of walking away, Nathan said, his eyes locked on the judge. I'm here to collect a debt. For James Peterson. Every person in the saloon was frozen, watching the drama unfold. This was more than a simple arrest. This was a reckoning. Suddenly a side door creaked open. Abigail slipped into the room, moving along the wall, the heavy pistol hidden in the folds of her skirt. The men were so focused on Nathan that no one noticed her. No one except Sheriff Markham. His eyes widened in shock, but he said nothing. He just watched, his face a canvas of conflict. You have no authority here, Cross, the judge blustered, trying to regain control. You're a disgraced marshal, a rogue agent. Marshal Duncan, I order you to arrest this man. Duncan stood up, pulling back his coat to reveal his own pistol. You heard him, Cross. It's over. You're right, Nathan said. It is. And then all hell broke loose. Nathan drew his pistol with blinding speed, but he didn't fire at Duncan or the judge. He fired at the massive crystal chandelier hanging over their table. The bullet shattered the chain, and the heavy fixture came crashing down, showering the table in glass and metal, sending Harrison and Duncan scrambling for cover. It was the distraction they needed. In that single moment of chaos, Abigail raised her own pistol. She wasn't aiming at a man. She was aiming at the bottle of whiskey in Judge Harrison's hand. She fired, and the bottle exploded, spraying the judge with cheap liquor and stinging glass. He yelped in pain and surprise, his attention diverted for a critical second. That second was all Nathan needed. He lunged forward, vaulting over the overturned table, and tackled Marshal Duncan to the ground. The two men grappled on the floor, trading brutal punches. Judge Harrison, seeing his protector occupied, made a run for the back door. But Sheriff Markham was suddenly in his way. The broken man had finally chosen a side. No more running, Judge, Markham said, his voice filled with a newfound resolve. He wasn't holding a gun. He just stood there, a human wall between Harrison and his escape. Harrison, his face twisted with rage, pulled a small derringer from his vest pocket. Get out of my way, you pathetic coward, he shrieked. He fired. The shot was deafening in the crowded room. Markham grunted and staggered back, clutching his side, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. But he didn't fall. He lunged forward and wrapped his arms around the judge in a bear hug, pinning his arms to his sides. Do it, Cross, he roared, his face contorted in pain. For the town! For justice! Nathan had finally subdued Duncan, knocking him unconscious with the butt of his pistol. He looked up, saw Markham and the judge locked in a desperate struggle, and knew he had only one chance. He took careful aim. He had one bullet left. But before he could fire, Abigail acted. She saw the derringer still clutched in Harrison's hand as he struggled against Markham. He was trying to bring it around for another shot. Without thinking, without hesitating, she fired her own weapon again. The bullet struck the judge's wrist. He screamed, and the derringer clattered to the floor. It was over. The saloon was silent, save for the ragged breathing of the combatants. Townsfolk stared, their faces a mixture of awe and horror. They had just witnessed the complete and total implosion of their town's leadership. Nathan rushed to Markham's side as the wounded sheriff finally slid to the floor, his strength giving out. Why? Nathan asked, pressing a hand to the bleeding wound. A man has to live with himself, Markham gasped, a pained smile on his lips. My son, he's a good boy. He just made a mistake. I couldn't let Harrison's poison ruin him too. The town doctor pushed through the crowd, and a moment later, the real law arrived. A squad of territorial rangers, summoned by the governor's telegram, stormed into the saloon, their rifles at the ready. They took the wounded Judge Harrison and the unconscious Marshal Duncan into custody. The conspiracy was finally, truly over. In the aftermath, as the smoke cleared and the wounded were tended to, Nathan found Abigail standing by the saloon doors. She was staring at the pistol in her hand as if she'd never seen it before. He gently took it from her. You saved his life, Nathan said softly. You saved Markham's life. I just acted, she whispered, still in shock. That's what heroes do, he said. He looked at her, and in the dim, chaotic light of the saloon, she saw the truth in his eyes. The lies were gone. The games were over. All that was left was the man, a flawed, complicated man who had dragged her through hell, but had never, not once, actually left her side. I'm not a hero, Nathan, she said, her voice quiet but steady. I'm a seamstress, and I think I'd like to go home. He nodded, a slow, understanding smile spreading across his face. There's a house on the edge of town, he said. Needs some work, but it's quiet, and the porch has a nice view of the mountains. He held out his hand. This time she took it. Their marriage had started as a lie, a desperate gambit in the face of death. Their partnership had been forged in deception and gunfire. But as they walked out of the saloon and into the cool night air, leaving the wreckage of Cedar Ridge's corruption behind them, they were finally just two people who had found each other in the storm. They had a lot to talk about, a lot to figure out. But for the first time, the future didn't look like a threat. It looked like a promise. 2 years later, the house on the edge of town was no longer a shack. It was a home. The Open Hand Ranch, they called it. A haven for children who, like them, had been lost in the storms of the frontier. They had built a family from the broken pieces of their lives, creating something strong and beautiful. Nathan Cross, the former marshal, found a different kind of justice in teaching a young boy how to mend a fence. Abigail Cole, the former seamstress, found a deeper purpose in mending the broken hearts of children who had nowhere else to go. Their life wasn't easy, but it was real. It was honest, and it was theirs. Sometimes in the quiet of the evening, they would stand on the porch and look out at the town of Cedar Ridge, now slowly healing from the wounds of the past. They had faced down the worst parts of the frontier, the greed, the hatred, the violence, and they had not only survived, but they had won. They had chosen to build something instead of breaking it. They had chosen hope over fear. And in a world that often seemed determined to tear people apart, they had proven that the strongest thing you can ever build is a life with someone you trust. If you enjoyed this story and you want to hear more tales of justice from the dark corners of history, do the strange and mysterious a favor and hit that subscribe button. And remember to turn on all notifications so you don't miss our next adventure into the shadows.